The men were laughing when they brought her to his ranch, and Marcus Reed stood there in the dust, watching a woman descend from that wagon with her head held so high it made the joke fall flat before it even landed. They had sent her to humiliate him. They had sent her because they thought a proud Apache woman arriving at the doorstep of a struggling rancher would be the final insult, the last push needed to drive him off land they wanted for themselves. But what those men didn't understand, what they couldn't possibly know, was that humiliation only works when someone accepts the shame being offered. And neither Marcus Reed nor the woman standing before him, Nalin they called her, had any intention of playing the role assigned to them. Marcus had been expecting trouble for months. The Silver Ridgeland Company had made their intentions clear through lawyers and threats, and thinly veiled warnings delivered by men in expensive suits who didn't know the first thing about working land with their own hands. His ranch sat on water rights they wanted, sat on a corridor they needed to connect their holdings, and Marcus Reed was the one stubborn obstacle refusing to move. They had tried money first, then intimidation, then isolation, turning the townspeople against him, spreading rumors about his finances, his character, his sanity for holding onto a struggling ranch when he could take their money and disappear. And when none of that worked, they tried mockery. The plan had been simple in their minds. Send an Apache woman to his ranch as a supposed bride. Let the whole territory laugh at the cowboy, desperate enough to accept such an arrangement. Let the shame drive him out where threats had failed. They had purchased Nalin from a corrupt Indian agent who saw indigenous women as commodities to be traded. They had paid for her transport like she was cargo. They had written up false papers suggesting Marcus himself had requested this arrangement. Papers they made sure reached every gossip and busybody in 3 counties. And they waited for the humiliation to do their work for them. But Nalin stepped off that wagon and looked at Marcus Reed with eyes that had seen far worse than these petty men could imagine. Eyes that had watched her people displaced, her family scattered, her entire world dismantled by forces that made a land company's greed look small and pathetic by comparison. She carried herself like royalty in exile, not like someone being discarded. And when Marcus met her gaze, he saw immediately that this woman was no one's punchline. He didn't laugh. He didn't send her away. He didn't play into their hands by rejecting her publicly, which would have given them the spectacle they wanted. Instead, Marcus Reed did something they never anticipated. He invited her inside, offered her water, asked her, in the broken Spanish that served as a common language between them, what she wanted. Not what they wanted, not what the situation demanded, but what this woman, this person standing exhausted and angry in his doorway, actually needed. And Nalin saw something in that question. She saw an opportunity where others saw only shame. She told him the truth, that she had been traded like livestock, that papers had been signed she never agreed to, that she had no money, no allies, no way back to what remained of her scattered people. That the men who brought her here expected her to be rejected, expected Marcus to send her away in anger, expected the whole thing to collapse into public embarrassment that would finally break his resolve. And Marcus understood immediately. This wasn't about him or her. This was about land, about water, about powerful men who would use any tool, including human beings, to get what they wanted. And standing there in his simple ranch house, Marcus Reed made a decision that would change both their lives. He asked Nalin if she wanted to stay, not as a bride, not as a servant, not as anything other than someone who needed refuge and was willing to work for it. He explained his situation plainly. The land company wanted him gone. They were escalating. They would use this stunt as ammunition either way, but if she stayed, if they presented a united front, it might buy time, might create confusion, might make the men behind this scheme uncertain about what was actually happening. And more than that, Marcus needed help. The ranch was too much for one person. He was losing ground daily, couldn't maintain the property and fight legal battles simultaneously. If Nalin wanted to stay, there was work. There was a place. There was an alternative to being discarded like trash by men who saw her as nothing. Nalin considered this carefully. She had been raised to trust her instincts about people. Her grandmother had taught her to read men by their actions, not their words. And this cowboy, this Marcus Reed, he had not touched her without permission, had not assumed ownership, had not treated her like property despite papers that falsely claimed otherwise. He had asked what she wanted. So few people had asked her that since the soldiers came. So few people had treated her choices as mattering at all. And though this situation was strange and complicated and born from cruelty, Nalin recognized something true in Marcus Reed's offer. He was offering partnership, not salvation, not charity, but the dignity of mutual need. And that she could work with. The first weeks were a test of will that neither of them anticipated. Nalin knew ranching. Her people had raised horses long before white settlers claimed expertise, but Marcus's methods were different, and the land itself fought them both. Early autumn was giving way to the harsh preparation for winter, and the ranch had been neglected too long. Fences needed mending. The well needed clearing. The barn roof had gaps that would spell disaster when snow came. And through it all, the town watched. The land company watched. Every trip to town for supplies became theatre, with Marcus and Nalin playing roles neither had auditioned for, but both committed to completely. They developed routines born from necessity. Nalin rose before dawn, as was her way, and tended to tasks Marcus had been postponing for months. She understood animals in ways that came from culture, not just experience, reading their moods, anticipating their needs, moving among them with an ease that made Marcus realize how much he'd been fighting his own livestock instead of working with them. She fixed the chicken coop predator damage in an afternoon, using techniques that seemed obvious once she showed him, but had never occurred to his linear cowboy thinking. She identified which grazing areas were being overused and suggested rotations he hadn't considered. And slowly, begrudgingly, Marcus realized this woman knew more about sustainable land use than he'd learned in a decade of stubborn trial and error. But knowledge created its own tension. Marcus had been raised in a world where men led and women followed, where a rancher's word was law on his own property, where accepting help, especially from a woman, especially from an Apache woman, could be seen as weakness. His pride wrestled with his pragmatism daily. When Nalin suggested a better way to manage the water distribution, he initially dismissed it. When she pointed out that his grazing pattern was destroying the land's ability to recover, he argued. When she showed him how to read weather signs he'd been ignoring, he felt the sting of inadequacy that comes from realizing you've been doing things wrong for years. And yet, the results were undeniable. The ranch began functioning better. Tasks that had overwhelmed him became manageable, and Marcus faced a choice that many men in his position never successfully navigate. He could cling to authority and watch everything collapse, or he could share power and possibly survive. Nalin watched this internal battle with patient calculation. She had survived worse than a proud man's wounded ego. She had watched entire ways of life destroyed by people who refused to learn from those they conquered. She had seen the cost of arrogance measured in suffering and death, and she had developed a sophisticated understanding of when to push and when to wait. So she didn't demand recognition for her contributions, didn't force confrontations about respect. Instead, she simply made herself indispensable. She made sure Marcus woke each morning to discover that problems he'd been dreading were already solved. She made sure visitors to the ranch saw order and competence where there had been chaos. She made sure that every person who came expecting to witness his humiliation instead saw a functioning operation that reflected well on him. Because Nalin understood something crucial, she didn't need credit. She needed security. And Marcus Reed's success was now tied directly to her own survival. The town's reaction evolved in ways both predictable and surprising. Some people treated the situation as the joke it was intended to be, making crude comments that Marcus learned to ignore and Nalin never acknowledged hearing. Others were confused, uncertain what to make of an Apache woman working alongside a white rancher with apparent equality. A few, mostly women who understood what it meant to be underestimated, quietly approved, offering Nalin small kindnesses when they encountered her. The shopkeeper's wife began setting aside certain supplies when she knew Nalin would be coming to town. The blacksmith stopped overcharging when he realized she could spot inferior metalwork instantly. The doctor's wife, who had Apache relatives through marriage, began speaking to Nalin in her own language, creating a connection that mattered more than either woman openly acknowledged. But the land company men, they were furious. Their joke had backfired spectacularly. Instead of humiliation, Marcus Reed was gaining a reputation for resourcefulness. Instead of isolation, he was building unexpected alliances. Instead of collapse, his ranch was showing signs of genuine recovery. And most infuriating of all, he had accepted their attempt to mock him and turned it into something that actually worked. The woman they'd sent as an insult was proving to be an asset they hadn't anticipated. And now they faced a dilemma: escalate and risk looking even more foolish, or back down and lose the momentum they'd been building. The decision was made for them when Nalin discovered something they'd desperately wanted to keep hidden. She found the documents, by accident, while searching the barn. For winter supplies, Marcus insisted he'd stored somewhere. Hidden in a trunk beneath moldy blankets were papers, official-looking documents with county, seals and signatures from men, whose names she'd heard Marcus mention with contempt. The papers outlined a scheme involving water rights and illegal diversions, and false surveys that would reroute creek access away from several small ranches, including Marcus's, and consolidate it under Silver Ridge Land Company control. The dates on the documents predated current surveys. The signatures included a county official everyone believed was honest. And the implications were explosive. This wasn't just aggressive business tactics. This was fraud. This was theft disguised as legal maneuvering, and someone had hidden the evidence in Marcus Reed's own barn. Nalin understood immediately why the documents were there. If the scheme was discovered and traced back to these papers, Marcus would be implicated. Found on his property, they'd suggest he was part of the fraud or at least knew about it. It was insurance for the land company. If their plan failed, they could sacrifice Marcus as the scapegoat, claiming he'd been the architect all along. And if their plan succeeded, they could simply retrieve the documents and no one would ever know they'd existed. It was elegant in its cruelty. But they hadn't counted on Nalin's thoroughness. Hadn't expected her to be searching forgotten corners of a barn they assumed Marcus barely maintained. Hadn't imagined this Apache woman they'd sent as a punchline would be the one to uncover their crimes. That evening, Nalin showed Marcus what she'd found. She watched his face cycle through confusion, understanding, and finally rage as the full picture became clear. He'd been fighting an enemy whose tactics were more sophisticated than he'd realized. The pressure to sell hadn't just been about business competition. It had been about covering up a crime that required his ranch's silence. And now they had leverage. Now they had evidence. Now Marcus Reed and the woman sent to humiliate him held cards the land company didn't know they'd lost. And as they sat in that simple ranch house kitchen, examining documents by lamplight, an unspoken partnership solidified into something much stronger. They were allies now, not by choice but by circumstance, not by affection but by shared enemies. And sometimes that's how the most formidable teams begin. Marcus wanted to go to the sheriff immediately. His instinct was to expose the crime, trust the law, believe that truth would prevail. But Nalin stopped him with a question that revealed how differently they understood power. She asked him who the sheriff answered to, who paid for his election, who controlled his budget, who held influence over his career. And as Marcus considered these questions, he realized with sinking certainty that the sheriff was likely already compromised. Men with enough money to forge county documents weren't amateurs. They bought protection before they bought land. and walking into the sheriff's office with evidence might just get them killed instead of getting them justice. So they needed a different strategy. Nalin suggested they wait, watch, learn who else might benefit from exposing the scheme. Because powerful men always had enemies, business rivals, political opponents, people they'd crossed on their way to the top. And if Marcus and Nalin could identify those enemies, they could weaponize this information properly instead of wasting it on corrupt officials. It was a sophisticated understanding of power dynamics that came from surviving systems designed to destroy her people. Nalin knew that justice rarely worked through official channels when those channels were controlled by the same people committing the crimes. Real change came from strategic leverage, from making it more costly to continue the crime than to stop it, from finding allies whose self-interest aligned with your goals. And that required patience Marcus wasn't sure he possessed. They began paying closer attention to everything. Who came to town and when? Who met privately with whom? What business relationships existed beneath the surface of polite society? Nalin had an advantage here. People underestimated her constantly. White settlers saw an Apache woman and assumed ignorance, assumed she couldn't understand their language or their business. They spoke freely around her the way people speak freely around servants or animals. And Nalin absorbed everything. She learned that the banker had been excluded from the land company's initial investments and resented it. She discovered that the newspaper editor's brother had lost his ranch to suspicious foreclosure proceedings. She identified the territorial representative who was building a political career on reforming land fraud and needed a major case to make headlines. Meanwhile, the land company escalated their pressure through different tactics. Cattle began disappearing from Marcus's herd. Not many, just enough to create ongoing loss and frustration. Fence lines were cut in the night. Supplies ordered from town mysteriously never arrived or arrived damaged. And the social pressure intensified. Business owners who'd been neutral suddenly refused service. Church ladies who'd been politely distant became openly hostile. Anonymous letters arrived calling Marcus a traitor to his race, accusing him of unnatural relationships, threatening violence if he didn't leave. The campaign was sophisticated and relentless, designed to create a siege mentality that would eventually break his spirit. But they had underestimated what Nalin brought to this fight. She had survived genocide, had walked hundreds of miles when her people were forced from ancestral lands, had watched children starve and elders die and entire cultures face extinction. And she had learned something through that suffering, that survival often depended on outlasting those who thought they'd already won. The land company expected quick collapse. They expected fear and desperation and mistakes born from panic. Instead, they got methodical resistance. When cattle disappeared, Nalin tracked them using skills her brothers had taught her, finding them penned miles away on property owned by a land company subsidiary. When fences were cut, she and Marcus installed them differently, using techniques harder to sabotage. When supplies were sabotaged, she taught Marcus which plants could substitute for what they couldn't buy, which wild foods could supplement their stores, how to make winter survivable with resources the land itself provided. And slowly, Marcus began to understand that survival was its own form of victory. Every day the ranch continued functioning was another day the land company's scheme was delayed. Every week that passed made their fraud harder to conceal, their illegal water diversion more obvious, their timeline more desperate. Because they needed Marcus gone by spring, needed his land incorporated into their holdings before the next territorial water survey, needed this resolved before their window of opportunity closed. And as autumn became winter and the ranch held steady, the pressure shifted from Marcus to them. They were losing time, losing momentum, and losing face in a community that was beginning to wonder why such powerful men cared so much about one struggling rancher. Winter brought its own challenges that tested everything they'd built. Snow came early and heavy, isolating the ranch for weeks at a time. Supplies ran lower than comfortable. The cold was relentless, and the work was endless. breaking ice on water troughs, ensuring livestock had shelter, maintaining fire, rationing food. But isolation also brought unexpected peace. Away from town's judgment and the land company's harassment, Marcus and Nalin developed rhythms that felt almost natural. They worked together with increasing efficiency, communication becoming less verbal and more intuitive. She learned his moods and methods. He learned to trust her judgment. And in the quiet evening hours, they began to talk, not about their situation, not about strategy or the land company or the uncertain future. They talked about life. Marcus told stories about his childhood in Missouri, about the father who died too young, and the dream of owning land that drove him west. Nalin spoke carefully about her grandmother's teachings, about what her people believed regarding the relationship between humans and Earth, about ceremonies and wisdom that white conquest had tried to erase but couldn't completely destroy. They discovered unexpected common ground. Both had lost mothers young, both understood loneliness, both carried grief for worlds that no longer existed in the forms they'd known. And something shifted between them. The walls built from mutual wariness began developing cracks. Not breaking down, that would take much longer, but allowing light through. Allowing possibility. By late winter, they'd become something neither quite had words for. Not married, despite the false papers that claimed it. Not merely business partners, though that's what they told anyone who asked. Not friends exactly. Friendship implied an equality of power they hadn't fully negotiated. They were connected, bound by circumstance and mutual dependence, and the strange intimacy that comes from surviving hardship together. Marcus caught himself watching her more than necessary, noticing the grace in how she moved, the intelligence in how she solved problems, the strength that had nothing to do with physical power. And Nalin found herself lowering guards she'd maintained for years, allowing herself to consider that perhaps this cowboy, this stubborn learning, occasionally infuriating man, might be someone worth trusting completely. Not because he was perfect, but because he kept choosing to do better. Spring arrived with a violence that matched the political climate. Snowmelt turned roads to impassable mud, creeks swelled beyond their banks, and the land company made their most aggressive move yet. They filed papers with the territorial office, claiming Marcus had abandoned his property over winter, using his isolation against him, arguing that months without town presence constituted legal abandonment. It was a creative lie, backed by affidavits from paid witnesses who swore they'd checked the ranch multiple times and found it empty. And under territorial law, abandoned property with contested ownership could be seized for public auction, which everyone knew the land company would win. Marcus discovered this when he made his first trip to town after the thaw, finding notice papers already posted declaring his ranch forfeit in 30 days, unless he could prove continuous occupation. The fury he felt was beyond anything he'd experienced. Months of resistance, months of survival, months of fighting to hold on to something that was rightfully his, and they'd simply lied him out of existence. Claimed he didn't exist when he'd been there suffering through every frozen morning and brutal evening. Claimed abandonment when Nalin had proof of their presence in journals she'd kept, in supplies they'd purchased before winter, in the very survival of livestock that couldn't have made it through without daily care. But proving that meant fighting in a legal system already corrupted by the same men stealing his land. It meant hiring lawyers he couldn't afford, meant battling in courts where judges were bought, meant playing a game rigged so thoroughly that truth was irrelevant to the outcome. Nalin saw his despair and made a decision. She reminded him they had leverage. They had documents proving fraud that implicated powerful people. They had evidence of crimes that could destroy reputations and end careers. And spring also brought something else. The territorial representative she'd identified months ago was touring the region, gathering stories for his land reform campaign. He would be in town for 3 days. 3 days to present evidence. 3 days to turn this private battle into a public scandal. 3 days to force the land company's hand by making the cost of continuing their fraud higher than the cost of stopping it. But using that leverage meant exposure. Meant risk, meant Nalin and Marcus both becoming targets in ways they'd avoided by staying quiet. And it meant trusting a politician, something neither was naturally inclined to do. They prepared carefully. Nalin organized the documents, creating a clear narrative of fraud that anyone could follow. Marcus gathered evidence of their continuous occupation, receipts, journal entries, testimony from the few townspeople willing to speak truth. And they approached the banker who'd been excluded from land company profits, offering him a deal. Provide them with financial records showing the land company's unusual transactions, and when the scandal broke, he'd be positioned as the honest banker who helped expose corruption. It was crass manipulation, appealing to his greed and wounded ego rather than his conscience, but it worked. Men like him didn't help because it was right. They helped because they saw advantage, and the banker saw opportunity in the land. Companies collapsed that exceeded any loyalty he might have felt toward them. The meeting with Representative Carlyle happened in the hotel's private dining room, arranged through the newspaper editor whose brother had lost his ranch. Nalin and Marcus arrived with documents, evidence, and testimonies that painted a picture of systematic fraud affecting multiple families across the territory. But Carlyle was a politician first and a reformer second, and his initial response was calculating rather than outraged. He asked about proof, about witnesses, about whether this story would survive challenge from expensive lawyers, about whether the people bringing him this evidence were credible or if their personal grievances would undermine the case. He looked at Marcus with professional skepticism and at Nalin with barely concealed doubt about whether a jury would believe an Apache woman's testimony about anything. And that's when Marcus did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He stood up, placed his hand on Nalin's shoulder, and told Representative Carlyle the complete truth. That she had been sent to him as a cruel joke. That she had been traded and transported like property. That every bit of competence and intelligence and strategic thinking that kept his ranch alive through winter and uncovered fraud that could topple powerful men. All of it came from this woman politicians and land barons treated as less than human. That if Carlyle wanted credibility, he should look at results, at a ranch saved, at documents found, at a conspiracy uncovered by someone everyone underestimated. And that if Carlyle's reform campaign couldn't make room for the truth about who actually did the work, then his campaign wasn't about justice. It was just another version of the same corruption wearing a different face. The room went very quiet. Nalin had not expected this, had not expected Marcus to defend her so publicly, so forcefully, so completely, had not expected him to risk his own credibility by tying it to hers. She had spent months making herself useful while remaining invisible, contributing without claiming credit, surviving by being underestimated. And now Marcus was destroying that protective camouflage by insisting the truth be told. It was either the most foolish thing he could do, or the most honorable. And as she met his eyes, she saw that he'd made the choice consciously. He was done pretending, done accepting a system where Nalin's contributions had to be hidden to be acceptable, done participating in her erasure even for strategic advantage. And that mattered, that changed something fundamental between them. Representative Carlyle studied them both for a long moment before responding. Then he smiled, not the politician's smile they'd seen earlier, but something more genuine. He said he'd built his career on land reform precisely because he'd watched too many good people destroyed by legal corruption. That he'd seen what happened when systems valued property over people, profit over justice, power over truth. And that, yes, he would take their evidence, would investigate thoroughly, would use his platform to expose the fraud. But he warned them both that going public meant becoming targets. The land company wouldn't just surrender. They'd fight. They'd attack credibility, manufacture scandals, possibly resort to violence. And once this story broke, there would be no going back to anonymous survival. They would be choosing visibility, choosing to fight openly, choosing to make themselves examples of either successful resistance or cautionary tales about what happens to those who challenge power. Marcus and Nalin looked at each other, and a conversation happened without words. They'd survived winter together, survived isolation and sabotage, and a legal system designed to destroy them. They'd built something that worked, not perfectly, but genuinely. And hiding it, pretending it was less than it was, diminishing what they'd accomplished to make other people comfortable. That would be its own kind of defeat. So they nodded to Carlyle and handed over the documents that would change everything. The evidence that would expose Silver Ridge Land Company's fraud. The proof that would validate Marcus's ownership and reveal the conspiracy to steal his land. And the testimony, both of them together, about exactly how that evidence had been found and what it meant. They were choosing to fight, choosing to matter, choosing to tell the truth regardless of cost. The next 2 days were a whirlwind of interviews, affidavits, and strategic planning. Carlyle's team worked efficiently, building a case that was airtight. The newspaper editor wrote stories that would publish simultaneously with Carlyle's official report. The banker provided financial records that corroborated the fraud. Other families who'd been affected came forward, emboldened by the possibility that someone might finally care. And through it all, Nalin and Marcus stayed together, presenting a united front that became part of the story itself. The Apache woman and the cowboy who turned a cruel joke into a partnership that exposed corruption. It was a narrative that resonated beyond the immediate facts. It spoke to possibility, to unlikely alliances, to the power of people dismissed by society to change outcomes when given opportunity. But as they'd been warned, the land company responded viciously. Stories appeared calling Marcus a liar and a fraud. Anonymous sources claimed Nalin had seduced him, manipulated him, invented evidence to steal land she could never own herself. The attacks were personal and cruel and designed to destroy credibility before the case could be heard fairly. Men appeared at the ranch, making threats that stopped just short of explicit violence. Townspeople who'd been warming to them suddenly grew cold again, uncertain whether to trust testimony that was being so thoroughly challenged by seemingly respectable sources. And there were moments, dark moments, in that uncertain week, when both Marcus and Nalin wondered if they'd made a catastrophic mistake by choosing visibility over survival. The hearing itself took place in the territorial capital, which meant traveling 2 days through country where they had more enemies than friends. Marcus borrowed a wagon and bought what supplies they could afford, and they made the journey with an awareness that they might be ambushed at any point. The land company had too much at stake to let this proceed quietly. But the journey proved uneventful. Either they'd been underestimated again, or Representative Carlyle had provided protection they never saw. They arrived in the capital exhausted and anxious, checking into a modest boarding house that catered to people involved in territorial business. And the next morning, they walked into a hearing room that would determine everything. The room was packed. Carlyle had ensured maximum publicity for the case, understanding that public attention was their best protection against corruption. Journalists from 3 territories sat taking notes. Other ranchers who'd been affected filled the gallery, and the land company had brought an impressive legal team. 5 attorneys in expensive suits who radiated confidence that money could still control outcomes. The territorial judge was an older man named Whitmore, who had a reputation for being difficult to influence, but not impossible. Everything would depend on evidence, credibility, and the ability to make complex fraud understandable to people who wanted clear villains and heroes rather than nuanced truth. Carlyle presented first, laying out the fraud systematically. The false surveys that rerouted water rights, the forged signatures on county documents, the pattern of property seizures that always benefited Silver Ridge Land Company, the illegal diversions that dried up creeks for small ranchers while flooding company holdings. He showed maps, presented documents, called witnesses who testified about losing their land to processes they'd never understood until seeing it explained in total. And he built toward the evidence that made it all undeniable. The papers Nalin had found hidden in Marcus's barn, The financial records the banker provided, the affidavits from people who'd been pressured to participate and now wanted immunity in exchange for testimony. It was comprehensive and damning and delivered with the polish of someone who'd prosecuted complex cases before. Then the land company attorneys attacked. They questioned the provenance of documents, suggested Marcus had manufactured evidence to avoid legitimate debts, implied that Nalin, an Apache woman with no legal standing, might have planted papers herself for reasons ranging from revenge to delusion. They painted Marcus as a failed rancher looking for scapegoats, and Nalin as an opportunist using victimhood to gain sympathy. They called character witnesses who testified that Marcus was unstable, that the ranch had been neglected long before any company involvement, that his resistance to selling was irrational given his financial situation. And they deployed the ultimate weapon, social prejudice. They suggested that Marcus's judgment was compromised by inappropriate relations with an Indian woman, that no credible white man would believe such testimony, that the entire case was built on the word of people whose word shouldn't matter in legal proceedings. The moment was critical. The hearing could collapse right there if Judge Whitmore allowed prejudice to substitute for evidence. And Nalin could see Marcus struggling, wanting to defend her, wanting to argue, wanting to fight against the injustice of having her dismissed as inherently unreliable. But before he could speak, something unexpected happened. The banker stood up, the same banker they'd manipulated into helping through appeals to greed and ego. He stood up and addressed the court directly, violating procedure but commanding attention. And he testified that he'd known about the land company's fraud for years, that he'd been complicit through silence because they'd threatened his business if he spoke, that he'd watched good people lose everything while he profited from processing their foreclosures, and that the evidence Nalin found wasn't manufactured. He'd seen similar documents in company offices, had processed transactions that made no sense unless fraud was occurring, and had remained quiet because he valued safety over justice. Until now, until seeing someone braver than him, willing to risk everything to tell truth. It was a stunning moment. The banker had nothing to gain and everything to lose from that testimony. His admission of complicity would cost him reputation and possibly freedom. But something about watching Nalin and Marcus fight against overwhelming opposition had broken through his calculated self-interest. Maybe it was conscience finally asserting itself. Maybe it was recognition that silence had its own costs. Or maybe it was simply that courage could be contagious, that watching other people choose principle over safety sometimes inspired the same choice in unexpected places. Whatever the reason, his testimony shifted everything. A white male banker confirming fraud carried weight that an Apache woman's evidence couldn't, as unjust as that reality was. And suddenly the land company's attorneys were scrambling to contain damage they hadn't anticipated. Judge Whitmore called a recess to review evidence privately. The wait was excruciating. Marcus and Nalin sat in the corridor outside the hearing room, surrounded by people but feeling entirely alone. They didn't speak much. There wasn't much to say. They'd done everything possible. The truth was presented as clearly as it could be. The outcome now depended on whether a territorial judge cared more about law or politics, more about justice or convenience. And neither of them had enough faith in the system to feel confident. They'd seen too much, survived too much, understood too thoroughly how power usually protected itself. But they sat together, shoulders touching, drawing strength from proximity, and waited for a verdict that would determine the next chapter of lives that had become unexpectedly intertwined. When the hearing resumed 2 hours later, Judge Whitmore delivered his ruling with a brevity that felt almost cruel, given what hung in the balance. He ruled that the evidence of fraud was compelling and warranted criminal investigation, that the documents found on Marcus Reed's property were clearly planted to implicate him rather than evidence of his participation, that the Territorial Land Office should immediately halt all proceedings regarding Marcus's ranch until a full audit of Silver Ridge Land Company's holdings and transactions could be completed, and that, this part delivered with particular emphasis, the practice of using human beings as pawns in business disputes was reprehensible regardless of the ethnicity or status of those individuals, and any evidence that people had been trafficked or coerced in service of property theft would result in additional charges. It wasn't a complete victory. The criminal investigation would take months. The land company wasn't immediately dissolved, but it was vindication. It was survival. It was the system working, however imperfectly, however reluctantly, to protect someone other than the powerful for once. The response was immediate and chaotic. Journalists swarmed Carlyle and the judge, demanding details and quotes. Other ranchers who'd lost land pushed forward, wanting to know if this ruling affected them. The land company attorneys retreated quickly, already planning appeals and damage control. And Marcus and Nalin found themselves surrounded by strangers offering congratulations they didn't quite feel ready to accept. They'd won a battle, not a war. The land company would fight back. The appeals could tie things up for years, and even if everything worked out legally, they still had to return to a community that might never fully accept what they represented. But standing there in that territorial building, receiving acknowledgement that they'd been wronged and were owed protection, it mattered. It validated months of struggle. It confirmed that fighting back had been right, even when it seemed futile. They stayed in the capital for 3 more days while Carlyle's team processed additional testimonies and the Territorial Attorney General opened formal criminal investigations. Other victims of land company fraud came forward, emboldened by the ruling. A fuller picture emerged of systematic corruption that extended beyond water rights into mining claims, timber contracts, and indigenous land seizures. The scandal metastasized into something much larger than Marcus's ranch, and he and Nalin found themselves transformed from victims to symbols, representatives of what was possible when people refused to be erased. Proof that the system could be challenged even by those it was designed to exclude. And while that symbolism felt too heavy, too disconnected from their actual experience of just trying to survive, they accepted it because the attention provided protection, because being visible made them harder to eliminate quietly, because sometimes survival meant accepting roles you never auditioned for and hoping you could grow into them. The journey back to the ranch felt different than the journey away. They carried the same exhaustion, the same wariness about potential ambush, the same uncertainty about what came next. But something fundamental had shifted between them. They'd stood together in the most public way possible, had defended each other against attacks meant to destroy credibility and character, had chosen to fight as partners rather than as individuals seeking separate survival. And during those 2 days traveling rough country back to land that was finally, legally, undeniably Marcus's, they talked about what came next, not just practically, but personally, about what their partnership meant beyond convenience, about whether survival could become something more, about futures that might be built from foundations laid in crisis. Marcus spoke first, which surprised Nalin, because he'd always been more comfortable with action than words. He told her that somewhere between winter isolation and territorial hearings, she'd stopped being someone he was helping and started being someone he couldn't imagine managing without, that her intelligence had saved him, that her courage had inspired him, that her presence had transformed a house into something that felt almost like home, and that if she wanted to leave now that the legal battles were settling, now that she had options, now that staying was choice rather than necessity, he would understand, would help her reconnect with her people, if that's what she wanted, would provide money and resources and whatever support she needed, because she didn't owe him anything, had already given more than anyone could reasonably ask, and he needed her to know that staying, if she stayed, should be because she wanted to, not because she felt trapped by circumstances or gratitude or obligation. It was the most vulnerable Nalin had seen him. This man who'd faced down corrupt land barons and hostile townspeople and legal systems rigged against him. He was nervous asking a woman what she wanted from their future. And something about that nervousness, that genuine uncertainty, that willingness to risk rejection by offering freedom, it moved something in Nalin that had been frozen for longer than she'd realized. She had spent years surviving, years protecting herself, years treating every interaction as potential threat and every alliance as temporary. And Marcus was offering her something different. Not ownership disguised as protection, not dependence disguised as partnership, but genuine choice, the dignity of deciding her own path without pressure or manipulation or the suffocating weight of someone else's expectations. And that gift, the gift of being asked rather than told, of having her autonomy respected, even when it might cost him everything that was worth more than safety or security or any practical consideration. She told him that she'd learned something unexpected over these months. That home wasn't a place you returned to, but something you built with people who saw you completely. That her people were scattered, her family lost to policies designed to destroy indigenous nations, her old life impossible to reclaim. That she could search for remaining relatives and maybe find some, but she'd still be searching for a past that couldn't be recovered, rather than building a future that might actually matter. And that here on this ranch with this stubborn cowboy who'd learned to listen, she'd found something she hadn't expected to find again: purpose, partnership, the possibility of creating something that honored where she'd come from while acknowledging who she'd become. She wasn't ready to call it love. That word carried too much weight, too much history, too many broken promises made by white people to indigenous people throughout centuries of violence and betrayal. But she was ready to call it commitment, ready to say she wanted to stay. Not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she'd chosen this place and this person as worth building toward. They arrived back at the ranch in late afternoon. And the property looked different somehow, more solid, more permanent, more like something worth fighting for. The territorial ruling had lifted an enormous weight. The ranch was secure. The legal challenges would continue, but from a position of strength rather than desperation. And the land itself seemed to respond to that security. Or maybe Nalin and Marcus just saw it differently, now that it represented choice rather than obligation. They worked together that evening in comfortable silence, tending animals, checking fences, moving through routines that had become second nature. And after a simple dinner, they sat on the porch watching spring sunset paint mountains in colors that made even difficult country look beautiful. It was peaceful, not perfect, too much remained unresolved for perfection, but peaceful in the way that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be, with exactly who you're supposed to be with, doing exactly what matters. Over the following months, they formalized what had been implicit, not through any legal marriage. Nalin had no interest in documents that claimed to define relationships between people, and Marcus understood why such papers felt like ownership rather than commitment. But through actions that demonstrated partnership more clearly than any ceremony could. They reorganized the ranch as a joint operation, both names on supply orders and bank accounts and property records where possible. They built a second bedroom, making it clear that sharing space was choice rather than assumption. They developed new routines that honored both their backgrounds, Nalin teaching Marcus practices from her people's relationship with land, Marcus sharing techniques from his ranching tradition that proved compatible with her methods. And they created something genuinely new, not Apache, not Cowboy, but a hybrid approach that took the best from both worlds and discarded elements that didn't serve sustainable land stewardship. The town's reaction evolved slowly. Some people never accepted them, would never accept an Apache woman and a white man building something together on equal terms, would never forgive Marcus for treating Nalin as an intellectual and practical equal, would never stop seeing their partnership as somehow wrong or unnatural or threatening to social order. But others came around. The ranchers who'd been saved by the territorial ruling recognized what Nalin's discovery had meant for all of them. The women who'd quietly supported her throughout became more vocal in their approval. Young people who were tired of old prejudices began asking Nalin's advice about land management and water conservation and animal husbandry. And gradually, the ranch became known not as a symbol of humiliation or scandal, but as an example of what cooperation could accomplish when people got past assumptions about who deserved respect and who deserved dismissal. They faced ongoing challenges, of course. The land company appealed the ruling multiple times before finally accepting defeat. There were legal fees and depositions and testimony that dragged on for 2 years before the criminal cases concluded with convictions and substantial fines. Some of the corrupt officials fled the territory. Others served prison time. The money recovered never fully compensated victims, but it helped. And Marcus and Nalin's ranch became a gathering place for others interested in sustainable practices that honored indigenous wisdom. They hosted teaching sessions where Nalin shared knowledge about water conservation, grazing rotation, and reading land health. They provided mentorship to young ranchers willing to learn methods different from what their fathers taught. And they built community, not based on ethnic identity or shared history, but on mutual respect and practical cooperation and recognition that survival in difficult country required learning from everyone who'd successfully lived there. Regardless of whose ancestors arrived first, the transformation that began as a cruel joke became something neither side anticipated. The men who'd sent Nalin to humiliate Marcus had intended to create a spectacle of degradation. Instead, they'd accidentally created a partnership that exposed their crimes and changed land policy across the territory. They'd meant to prove that an Apache woman had no value. Instead, they demonstrated that underestimating people based on race or gender or social status was not just morally wrong, but strategically foolish. They'd tried to use human beings as disposable tools. Instead, they'd learned that human beings, when given dignity and opportunity, could dismantle systems that seemed immovable. The irony was complete. The weapon they deployed against Marcus Reed had become the force that destroyed them. And the woman they'd treated as worthless had proven more valuable than any of them would ever be. 5 years after that first day when Nalin stepped off a wagon and into Marcus's life, they stood together at a territorial hearing on indigenous land rights. Nalin had been asked to testify about water management practices her people had used for centuries, practices that territorial authorities were finally, grudgingly admitting might have merit. Marcus stood beside her, not as a guardian or handler or translator, but as partner, supporting her work, proud of her expertise, comfortable with being the less knowledgeable person in the room when the subject was land stewardship. And when a territorial official made a dismissive comment about whether indigenous knowledge was really applicable to modern ranching, Marcus's response was immediate and forceful. He described in detail how Nalin's methods had saved his ranch, how her understanding of water cycles had prevented erosion that would have destroyed grazing land, how her approach to animal management had improved herd health beyond anything conventional methods achieved, how dismissing her knowledge was dismissing provable results simply because they came from someone that official had been trained to see as inferior. It was a defense that came from 5 years of partnership, 5 years of learning to trust her judgment completely, 5 years of recognizing that intelligence and wisdom had nothing to do with formal education or cultural background or any of the arbitrary markers powerful people used to justify excluding others from decision-making. That evening, they returned to their ranch, their home, exhausted but satisfied. The hearing had gone well. Nalin's testimony had been recorded for territorial records. Small progress toward recognizing indigenous land management expertise. Not revolution, but evolution. Not justice, but movement toward it. And sometimes that's all you can ask from systems built on generations of wrong. You push, you persist, you document what works, you make it impossible to ignore evidence. And you trust that enough small victories eventually create momentum that becomes unstoppable. They sat on their porch, the porch they'd rebuilt together, on land they'd defended together, overlooking country they'd learned to work with rather than against. And Marcus took Nalin's hand, holding it with a familiarity that came from years of shared struggle and shared success. It was a simple gesture, but it represented something profound. It represented two people who'd been thrown together as a joke and had chosen to build something real from that attempted humiliation. Nalin looked at Marcus and saw something she'd never expected to see again. After everything she'd survived, she saw a future, not just survival, but possibility. Not just getting through each day, but building towards something meaningful. She saw a partnership that honored both who she'd been and who she was becoming. She saw a home that wasn't about erasing her identity, but about creating space for it to exist, alongside someone else's. And she saw a man who'd proven through years of action that his respect wasn't conditional on her behaving in ways that made him comfortable, but was rooted in genuine recognition of her worth as an equal. That was rare. That was precious. That was something worth choosing every single day. And as night fell over land they'd fought so hard to keep, Nalin felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She felt peace, not the absence of struggle. There would always be struggle, but peace in knowing that wherever that struggle led, she wouldn't face it alone. She'd chosen a partner who'd proven worthy of the choice. And that made everything, all the hardship, all the uncertainty, all the fear, worth enduring. The story spread throughout the territory and beyond. The Apache woman and the cowboy who'd turned a cruel joke into a successful ranch and a genuine partnership. People embellished it, romanticized it, turned it into legend that didn't quite match the messy reality they'd actually lived. But the core truth remained undeniable. That respect could bridge divides society insisted were impossible. That partnership could create strength that neither person possessed alone. That dignity, real dignity, not the false kind granted by social position, came from recognizing the full humanity of everyone you encountered, regardless of what culture taught you about who mattered and who didn't. And that sometimes the greatest victories came from refusing to accept the roles others assigned you, from choosing to write your own story, even when powerful people insisted they'd already written it for you, from surviving not by becoming what others expected, but by becoming more fully yourself in alliance with someone who supported that becoming. Years later, after Marcus died peacefully in old age, and Nalin continued running the ranch with help from younger partners she'd trained, people asked her about that first day, about stepping off a wagon into a situation designed to humiliate, about what she'd been thinking, about whether she'd imagined it would lead to everything it became. And Nalin's answer was always the same. She said she hadn't been thinking about the future at all. She'd been thinking about survival, about getting through that day and the next one, and the one after that, about finding solid ground in a world that kept shifting beneath her feet, but refusing to be destroyed by people who saw her destruction as acceptable collateral damage in their pursuit of profit. The future, the partnership, the love, the legacy, the changes they'd helped create, all of that came from a foundation of simply refusing to quit, of waking up each morning and choosing to keep going, of finding someone else who made the same choice, and building something together from those parallel commitments to persistence. It wasn't romance that saved them. It was stubbornness, and perhaps that's the most powerful force of all. The stubborn insistence on mattering when the world keeps suggesting you don't. The stubborn commitment to building when others only destroy. The stubborn belief that your life, your choices, your work, your love has value regardless of whether powerful people acknowledge it. That stubbornness. That's what turned a joke into a legacy. That's what transformed humiliation into triumph. That's what proved that the most dangerous thing you can do to people trying to erase you is survive and thrive and build something so solid that long after you're gone, it stands as evidence that they failed, that you mattered, that your story deserved to be told, that you were here, and that you chose, despite everything, despite everyone, to make that presence count. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next Western story. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far these stories reach. And when you're done, check out these other powerful Western tales on the screen, each one filled with grit, heart, and redemption. Thanks for riding with us today. See you in the next story.